Hi, I'm Bande Sujata and welcome everybody. Today we're going to begin a course of some discussions about the scripture in the Pali Tripitaka called the Itivuttaka, or so it was said. Let me begin with the first sutta. This was said by the Buddha, the perfected one, that is what I heard. Mendicants, give up one thing and I guarantee you non-return. What is that one thing? Greed is the one thing. Give it up, and I guarantee you non-return. That is what the Buddha has said. On this it is said, when overcome by greed, beings go to a bad place. Having rightly understood that greed, the discerning give it up. Once they've given it up, they never return to this world. This too was spoken by the Blessed One. That is what I heard. So this is the first discourse in the collection of the Itivuttaka, and as we can see that it returns to some of the great themes that resonate throughout the whole of the Buddha's teachings. First of all, the primacy and the powerful role that greed has in trapping us within suffering. So this whole sutta is the Buddha focusing on just this one thing. And then the idea that the liberation from that greed can lead to what the Buddha here is calling non-return. And those of you who are familiar with the Buddha's scheme of enlightenment would know that the Buddha spoke of four stages or four steps in the sequence of enlightenment known as stream entry, once return, non-return, and arahantship or perfection. And each of those stages of enlightenment is defined by the giving up of certain defilements, certain tendencies in the mind that tend to trap us into suffering. The third stage out of those four is what's called non-return and is characterized by the complete abandoning of greed and hate. And so this is why the Buddha is specifically mentioning non-return here, right, as being the result of giving up greed. A non-returner will, according to the teachings in the suttas, a non-returner will, when they pass away from this life, they will be reborn in a very high heaven realm, one of the Brahma realms, where they will remain and attain final nibbana in that state. So they won't come back to be reborn in this world or in any of the other sense sphere worlds again, but they just have one more birth in the Brahma realm. And the sutta goes on to talk about how if you give up greed, you realize non-return, but when you're overcome with greed, you go to a bad place. It means to a rebirth in a suffering destiny. That means in the hells, animal realm, the ghost realm, or in a bad destiny in the human realm. Once they've given it up, they never return to this world. This was spoken by the Blessed One. That is what I heard. This very pithy and very simple sutta immediately alerts us to something of the nature of the Itivuttaka as a collection. Perhaps the most important thing is that the text is immediately invoking the kinds of ideas and kinds of concepts with which we are very familiar if we have read other suttas in the Nikayas. In other words, this is not something which is presenting a radically new doctrine. It's not something which is presenting something which is very different from what we've heard before. It's a restatement of ideas that we've heard frequently elsewhere. And in fact, a very large proportion of the Itivuttaka really consists of things that are more or less recycled from other suttas. I haven't calculated it, so I'm not really sure what the percentage is, but I think that probably most of the material in the Itivuttaka is found elsewhere in the suttas as well. So what is the Buddha saying here? Is the Buddha saying that greed is the only thing we have to worry about because it's the one thing, we don't have to worry about anything else? Let's have a look at sutta number 2. This was said by the Buddha, the perfected one. Thus, that is what I heard. Mendicants, I give you one thing and I mendicants, give up one thing and I guarantee you non-return. What one thing? Hate is the one thing. Give it up and I guarantee you non-return. That is what the Buddha said. On this it is said, when overcome by hate, beings go to a bad place. Having rightly understood that hate, the discerning give it up. Once they've given it up, they never return to this world. This too was spoken by the Blessed One. That is what I heard. So that's disappointing, I have to admit. So I thought that we were going to be able to get away with just giving up greed and we could leave hate and all the other ones alone, but it seems that it's a little bit more complicated than that. Well, I don't know about a little more complicated, but perhaps more integrated or more holistic. Why is greed the one thing and hate is also the one thing? Well, I think that the point here is that these things are actually flip sides of the same coin. That if it's because of our greed for things, our attachment and desire for things, that we also hate. Think about it. Think about how, say, violence manifests in the world. Right? Extreme manifestations of hate, domestic violence. Right? People that we love are the ones that we hurt. Or, say, violence and conflict in society, the ones who, when wars are fought, then that hate erupts because of the desire usually for something, for some resource, for monopolization of money, for property, for all of these kinds of things. So desire leads to its flip side of hate, and hate leads to the flip side of desire, and these things are very closely intertwined. But at least we're lucky we only have to worry about greed and hate. Hang on, there's another one. Give up one thing and I guarantee you non-return. What is that one thing? Delusion is the one thing. Give it up and I guarantee you non-return. Now, each of these suttas, you may have noticed, consists of an introductory passage where there's a prose statement of what the main sutta is about, and then a verse that reflects on it. And the verse, these first few suttas, is very much the same. When overcome by delusion, beings go to a bad place. Having rightly understood that, the discerning give it up. Once they've given it up, they never return to this world. This too was spoken by the Blessed One. That is what I heard. So the verses given at the end, which summarize and reflect and give a different perspective on what prose sutta was about. This is a very common feature of ancient Indian scriptures. The same thing is spoken in different ways as a way of helping to memorize it, to reflect on it, and to hammer home the lessons so that you don't forget about it. So these repetitions always serve a purpose. The introduction of delusion here, I think personally, is a little bit slightly, I don't know about odd or incongruous, but a little bit perhaps slightly unexpected, because I mentioned before that for non-return, that one abandons greed and hate, but delusion is still very much in place. So a non-returner still has delusion, even if only in a very attenuated form, but they still have it. But here delusion is being brought in as well. And I mean, we could reflect on the reasons why that is. It's possible it was just because of simply kind of being a bit over systematic with the text, or could be that there's a good reason for it to be there. The next sutta, I give you one thing, and I guarantee, give up one thing, and I guarantee you non-return. What one thing? Anger is that one thing. Give it up. The following sutta, number 5, give up one thing and I guarantee you non-return. What is that one thing? Disdain is makha. Give up disdain and I will guarantee you non-return. This is like a kind of hate, like a kind of contempt or looking down on people. Conceit is that one thing. Give that up and I guarantee you non-return. So we have quite a few one things that we have to give up. So that's the first 6 texts in the Itivuttaka, and they all revolve around the same sort of template. One thing that we have to give up, and we have to, and that's repeated with the different variations of the different defilements. But the basic idea is the same throughout all of that. And again, we're noticing patterns that are very familiar from the Nikayas, from the main Nikayas, where you have these templates and they're repeated with variations and so on. So this way of teaching is also very familiar from the Buddha's general approach. So we've read a few of the suttas from the Itivuttaka. Let's just back up a little bit and reflect on the nature of this text as a whole. Now, we've heard in the text that there's like a catchphrase at the beginning and the ending of the text. This was said by the Buddha, the perfected one, that this is what I heard. So it's interesting that this is not the same framework that's normally used throughout all of the prose suttas that always begin evam me suttam. That's how I heard. Here it's beginning, this was said by the Buddha, the perfected one, that is what I heard. And then there's another little break between the prose and the verse. On this it is said. And then finally, at the end, this too was spoken by the Blessed One, that is what I heard. So that framing of the text is different than the normal framing that we see throughout the remainder of the Nikayas. It's just unique to the Itivuttaka. And clearly it has something to do with the name Itivuttaka. If we look at the Pali of that text, and I won't be looking too much at the Pali during this course, but here if we look at the Pali of the text, Vuddhan Hedang Bhagavata, this was spoken by the Buddha. Vuddham Arahata, this was spoken by the perfected one. Dit me suttam. So what the text does is it has the phrase di, was short for iti me suttam. Now iti and evam are synonyms. Right? So iti me suttam and evam me suttam have exactly the same meaning. And what they mean is this is something which has been passed down or repeated or which has been passed down through oral tradition. It does not mean something which means I was there at the time and that's what I heard. Right? It's something which has been passed down. And in the at the end of the sutta, it also says "Ayampi atho vutto bhagavata iti me suttam." Right? So this thing was spoken by the Buddha, so I have heard. So there's a slight variation on the phrase. Now, in and of itself, it's not necessarily that significant, but it is interesting in that it gives a distinct character, almost like a tag or a piece of metadata that will identify the texts from this particular collection. And of course, it raises the question, why is that? Why is that particular tag being used? Now, before I go on to that story, I'll just make one little remark about the translation. Now, I should mention that the Itivuttaka has been translated a number of times into English, and quite well. It's been translated by John Ireland, by Peter Masefield, and by a number of others. It's quite a short text. The Pali is, for the most part, fairly straightforward, and it doesn't pose huge translation difficulties. But one of the things which I would question in a lot of former translations is that last line, Ayampi atto vutto bhagavata, often translated as this is the meaning of what is said by the Buddha, where the word atta is translated as if it meant meaning. Now, meaning is, of course, one of the meanings of the word atta. However, if that was what it meant here, it seems a little bit grammatically unexpected. You'd expect something like vuddhasa atto, or something like that, to express the meaning of what was said. In fact, the word atta is used frequently throughout the suttas and the Vinaya in the sense of simply like the substance or the matter of something. And that clearly is, to my mind, is clearly what is meant here. It doesn't mean this is the meaning of what the Buddha said, because when texts explain the meaning, then it's in these kinds of early texts, it's very clear what they're doing. They'll say this is what the text is, and this is the meaning of the text, right? So there's like a text and commentary. But here we don't find a text and commentary. We just find the text and then the repetition of the text, more or less in verse form. It's not really drawing out the meaning of it. It's not a commentarial kind of literature. So I don't think it means the atta in the sense of meaning at all. It just means this is the substance, this is the matter that was spoken of by the Buddha. So I just mentioned that in case you encounter that different rendering in different translations around the place, and so you understand why it is that certain translators translated in one way and certain translators translated in another way. I think it's important to just bear in mind that for myself as a translator, that we have incredible respect and reverence for all those who've come before, because translating is not easy, and I am able to have the luxury of tweaking and adjusting a few minor things that previous translators have done, because they have done so much of the hard work and so much of the spade work that I can rely on in interpreting things. So don't get too hung up about differences in translations. Typically, over time, new generations of translations will learn from previous ones, and typically over time, translations on the whole get better, and so that's a good thing. But it's a process, and I'm sure that there'll be plenty of people who will build on my work and make improvements on it as well. All right, so we've seen how the word Itivuttaka is used in the texts of the Itivuttaka, right? It thus was said, and we've seen that framework, and we've seen that the content of the texts is pretty much what we would expect from an early sutta. We're not dealing with something which is a radically different kind of material at all. But that still leaves unanswered the question of exactly why this text is the way that it is. And I will come back to that question in a minute. But before I come back to that question, I would like to maybe read another sutta or two. And one of the nice things about this collection is because the suttas are nice and short, that we can perhaps intersperse some of the suttas with the commentary. So sutta number 7. This was said by the Buddha, the perfected one. That is what I heard. Mendicants, without directly and completely understanding the all, without dispassion for it and giving it up, you can't end suffering. By directly knowing and completely understanding the all, having dispassion for it and giving it up, you can end suffering. That is what the Buddha has said. On this it is said, those who know the all as all are not attracted to anything. They completely understand and have risen above all suffering. This too was spoken by the Blessed One. So here we're introducing a new sutta template. Rather than one thing to give up, we're talking about a completely knowing and completely understanding. And here, completely understanding the all. Now, the all is a concept which is of great significance and depth in Buddhist philosophy and in Indian philosophy more generally. In the Buddhist teachings, the most obvious meaning of the word all is to say the all of experience, in the sense of the all of the sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thoughts that are happening in the mind. So everything which you experience, everything which is part of that world that we've lived in from our birth till our death, this is the all. And so the Buddha said that typically the Buddha's philosophy was that the all, that we shouldn't kind of reify the all, we shouldn't treat the all as some kind of spiritual goal or spiritual oneness. So he said this is one extreme. Sabang ekatang, everything is oneness, is one extreme. So that all that we've experienced is in fact made up of these different senses and different sense experiences and so on. The next sutta, sutta number 8, then continues along this same theme. Without directly knowing and completely understanding conceit, without dispassion for it and giving it up, you can't end suffering. But by directly knowing and completely understanding conceit, having dispassion for it and giving it up, you can end suffering. On this it is said, these folk are caught up in conceit, tied by conceit, delighting in conceit. Not completely understanding conceit, they return in future lives. Those who have given up conceit, freed in the ending of vanquishers of the tie of conceit, have risen above all suffering. This too was spoken by the Blessed One. That is what I heard. So, sorry, I stumbled over that last verse. I should mention that the translation I'm reading from now is not one of the excellent translations which I've referred to before, but is my own draft translation, which I'm working on at the moment. So there's likely to be some rough bits, and this I think is a bit of a rough bit, and I'll have to revise it. Not completely understanding conceit, they return in future lives. Those who've given up conceit, freed in the ending of conceit, vanquishers of the tie of conceit, have risen above all suffering. Okay. Well, I'll go and review that. But anyway, so here, conceit in Buddhism, again, a very important topic. Conceit is essentially the way that the mind moves around the concept of an I, moves around the concept of a self, and is not merely conceit in the sense of thinking that you're better than everybody else. The Buddha said that this is only one of three kinds of conceit. Thinking that you're better than everybody else, thinking that you're worse than everybody else, and thinking that you're equal to everybody else. And these kinds of conceit are all of them very powerful, and all of them play a role in the creation of suffering. The most obvious kind of conceit, when we think about it, is the idea that we think that we're superior to people. But in a way, that's the least interesting, or perhaps the least powerful of these forms of conceit, because it's relatively obvious. And if you have pride and if you have thoughts of how much you're better than everybody else, then it's fairly obvious, and then it means you've got something to look at in terms of your conceit. But if you're thinking that you're the same as everybody else, how is that a conceit? It's a complicated one. I might return to that one later. Actually, I'm just going to break the talk for one moment. As you can see, it's getting a little bit dark as I'm talking, and I'm just going to pop up and turn the lights on. Okay, very good. So, conceit. All right, so what I'm going to do now is detour once more and have a bit of a look at the background of the text. We mentioned that the name Itivuttaka clearly is related to the phrase, thus it was said, which we find in each of the suttas there. But that's only telling part of the story. Now, the earliest appearance of the word Itivuttaka is in a list of 9, what's called the Navanga Dhamma, the 9 factors of the Dhamma, or the 9 categories of the teaching. And that those 9 categories of the teaching are found in the Nikayas themselves, okay, spoken by the Buddha. And they consist of the earliest sort of comprehensive categorization of the Buddha's teaching into literary divisions. All right? So before we had Nikayas, before we had Tripitaka, before we had like suttas and all of these kinds of things that we find today, we had the Navanga Dhamma, or the 9 categories of the Dhamma. In the Pali tradition, it's consistently 9. In the northern traditions, they often add another 3 to make 12, but they also have the 9 in there sometimes. And the nature of these 9, what's actually going on with this, is a little bit complicated and not particularly obvious. Now, the obvious inference is to say that when the Buddha mentioned Itivuttaka in that list of 9 things, that he meant the same thing that he meant the book that we could today call the Itivuttaka. That's a fairly obvious inference. And look, that may be true. On the other hand, it doesn't seem to be obviously true. most of the things which are mentioned in that list of the 9 Dhammas are not exactly the same, or at least are not obviously exactly the same as what we find today. And the most basic example of that is the very first one of the Angas, which is sutta. Now, when we hear a sutta, well, we know what a sutta is, right? A sutta is a sutta, right? It's one of the suttas. That's what the sutta means. But in the Navanga Dhamma, we have like 5 categories, all of which are suttas. And yet the first one is also a sutta. Seems a bit weird, doesn't it, right? So there's some kind of issue going on here. I think what's happening is that the word sutta originally had a more narrow meaning for a particular type of teaching, and later became generalized to refer to all of the teachings. And I think that the narrow meaning is more in line with the meaning of sutta in the Indian tradition generally, which is of a pithy prose doctrinal statement. That's what a sutta is. And we still find that meaning of sutta in the Buddhist texts as well. For example, the Patimokkha, the list of rules for monks and nuns, is referred to in the suttas as the sutta, and clearly that was meant as like a mnemonic device. So you memorize the sutta, you memorize the actual pithy short statements, which then would be explained. So one of the other of the angas is the vyakarana, which is an explanation. So that kind of makes sense because we can see in a lot of the suttas, what are the discourses, that they consist of a short pithy statement on the Four Noble Truths or the Eightfold Path or something, and then an explanation in the form of questions and answers. So I think this is what it means by sutta and vyakarana. Anyway, I don't want to get too far afield into these questions. I simply want to suggest that it's not immediately obvious that Itivuttaka means the same thing as the book Itivuttaka. Now, in the suttas, we also find similar phrases to Itivuttaka used in a quite different context. A word like, say, itihasa, itihitiha. And these are words which are used to refer to, essentially what they refer to is a legend or the sayings of old, something like that. And in that case, it's sort of the word. It has a kind of a sense of something which has been sort of passed down from hoary antiquity. I suspect that that's what the original meaning of the word Itivuttaka was, and I suspect that when we find occasional cases within the Nikayas where the Buddha is quoting from or referring to an ancient legend or a verse or something which he is attributing to some teacher or something of the past, that I suspect that this is perhaps what was originally meant as the Itivuttaka. But like I said, that's just a suspicion. There is another Itivuttaka which is found in the Chinese canon, and that one was translated by Xuanzang, the great Chinese translator. And that Itivuttaka, I haven't studied it in any detail, but that Itivuttaka apparently consists of only the first couple of chapters, so it's incomplete compared to the Pali. Whether that means that the Pali has been expanded or that the Chinese version has suffered textual loss is a bit hard to say. But in terms of what is actually there, it's quite similar to the Pali text. I won't be referring to it in detail as we go, I'll be focusing on the Pali. So again, this is some kind of background as to what the word Itivuttaka means. And I'm sorry that couldn't be more kind of decisive about that. But what is well known is that there is a quite lengthy, quite exotic and quite fascinating narrative background to the Itivuttaka. And that narrative background is that the Itivuttaka was actually spoken to the laywoman Kujuttara, who was a handmaiden in the court of Queen Samavati, who was queen to the king Udena in the city of Kosambi. And the basic idea was that Kujuttara got Venerable Ananda to come and give the teachings, and he would give teachings regularly for the court women, and then they would memorize those. And according to tradition, when the Tripitaka was memorized, the monks more or less forgot about those ones until they had to learn them from Kujutara's court, or from the tradition which had been passed down from them. So this is an interesting story, and if you want to look at more background, it's a very colourful background and a very interesting sort of set of stories that revolve around Kosambi. So definitely worth looking at that legendary history, but that would take us a little bit too far away from our current topic. So I won't dwell on it too much. But of course, the question should be asked is, to what extent is that a reliable story? Is that really what happened? Is that a myth of authenticity, or is it a genuine historical account, or is it perhaps a bit of both? Again, I don't want to give a definitive answer to that question, but I suspect that the answer to that is that it's probably a bit of both. When we're dealing with stories of authority and stories of authenticity, then of course it's always wise to retain a degree of caution and skepticism, because the overwhelming desire in ancient times was to attribute one's ideas and one's facts to a wisdom of the past, and the narratives were constantly being invented that would do that. We find this throughout the whole of Buddhist tradition. So, and those narratives are frequently contradictory, frequently anti-historical, and frequently involve impossible things. So we certainly can't take them all just on face value simply because it forms part of a tradition. On the other hand, excessive skepticism is also unwarranted, because we have to have a starting point in understanding what the truth is and what reality is, and merely being skeptical of everything because you can't prove it 100% is not a sign of wisdom, it's a sign of folly. And down that road lies the path of delusion, the path of, in modern days we see the path of all of these conspiracy theories. And there's a lot of things in common, I believe, between the kinds of nutty conspiracy theories you get about the COVID pandemic, or you get about all of these things today, and a lot of the theories which have been advanced by some academics, especially American academics like Gregory Chopin, who have used a kind of excessive and extreme skepticism to dismiss the possibility of knowing, and to deny the worth of even trying to learn about things that might be real. And this is an extreme position whose outcome is simply to discourage people from bothering even to try. And instead it fuels conceit, because you think that you're very clever because you can find something wrong with a 2,500-year-old ancient scripture. Congratulations. You found something wrong with the 2,500-year-old ancient scripture. I'm not sure how much of an achievement you think that is, but personally I think it's better to listen and to learn. And yes, we listen and learn with intelligence and with scrutiny and with our critical mind, but we don't just give ourselves over to extreme skepticism. All right, so let's have a look a bit at the pros and cons, right, from a historical point of view. So what reasons do we have to think that that story is true? Well, here's a few things. Number one, it's said in the Pali commentaries. Okay, fair enough. There's a lot of things which are in the Pali commentaries which obviously are embellished and so on, but there's also a lot of very valid historical information there. So the fact that they're in the Pali commentaries, that's a good starting point. Or we don't find all of the details of that story within the early canon. We only find hints at it here and there. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's not true, because the early canon doesn't contain a lot of connected narrative material. So there's that. Now, the laywoman Kujuttara is elsewhere throughout the Nikayas regularly raised up by the Buddha as being the example of one of the greatest upasikas or laywomen disciples. So she is held up as an ideal for the laywomen community to emulate. And so, there's that. There's also, she's specifically said in the Anguttara Nikaya to be the foremost in being very learned. So Kujuttara is the most learned. And again, that tracks with the idea that she learned the Itivuttaka. Samavati, remember that Samavati was the queen under whom Kujuttara was the handmaiden. And Samavati is said in the suttas to be the foremost in loving kindness among all the upasikas. So again, that kind of tracks, right? That she was like supporting the community to learn the Dhamma and so on. So that seems to be relatively consistent. One of the sort of the tragic ending of this particular story was that the harem at some point burnt down and that the people there were all killed. This is reported in the harem women were all killed. This is reported in the Udana, where the Buddha is told of this, and he confirms that all of the women who were killed were at least stream enterers. So that particular kind of narrative where there's like a confirmation of the spiritual attainments of people in the story, that kind of narrative tends to be quite different if we look at the different versions of texts. So that the Pali might say one, the Chinese might say another thing, the Sanskrit might say another thing. And it's the kind of detail which was definitely subject to a lot of later elaboration. So I personally wouldn't put a huge amount of stock in the statement that they were all at least stream enterers. I mean, maybe so. I can't say whether it wasn't the case. I'm just saying that from a textual basis, I don't take it as being hugely a strong piece of evidence. But the idea that the harem was burnt down does form a major part of the commentarial story and does kind of track with the shape of the story as we have. So we can certainly say that this story is kind of internally consistent within the early texts and the commentaries. So that's good. I mean, and to contrast that with, say, something like the story of Angulimala, where again, a very well-known story, but the story as found in the later tradition is not really consistent with the story found in the suttas. So it's internal consistency, so that's good. What about like just plausibility, right? I mean, is it very likely that you had a circle of court women and harem women who are so dedicated to learning the Dhamma? Well, I mean, kind of yes and no. I mean, it seems very idealized, right? I mean, and we can suspect that there was a degree of perhaps exaggeration there. But on the other hand, if you have sort of charismatic and very well-intentioned leaders to motivate a community and to bring people together, then there's plenty of examples in modern times of groups that are formed in all kinds of settings where there have been very dedicated Dhamma practitioners. Court women they would have had time on their hands, as opposed to, say, working women and housewives and so on. There's no reason, I think, to think that they shouldn't have been learning the Dhamma. Of course, it raises the question of the status of women and the role of education in women in the time of the Buddha. Clearly, there are indications that the men tended to get better education than the women. Certainly, that was the case within the Brahmanical tradition, where only men were supposed to learn the Brahmanical texts, according to certain statements within those texts. However, the witness of the Brahmanical texts themselves, particularly the Upanishads, the older Upanishads, especially the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, show women who are very learned and taking part in debates at the very highest level with the male Brahmins. So the idea that women were somehow excluded from education is not, to my mind, supported by the evidence. It seems to me more likely that it was a later situation and it represented a situation of what perhaps the Brahmin patriarchs or certain Brahmin patriarchs wanted to be the case rather than what was actually the case. So within the Vinaya, you find many examples of bhikkhunis who are very learned, who are obviously very highly attained and who are praised for being learned, who teach students and so on. And this is something which is maintained throughout the Buddhist tradition for the first 1,000 years or so, roughly 1,000 years or so. The archaeological record in ancient India records the giving and offerings and donations of stupas and statues and temples and the like. And you find like inscriptions in those that will record often who the donor is. And those inscriptions will not infrequently mention a bhikkhu or a bhikkhuni as being the sponsor of that donation. So that would be a case where a bhikkhuni or a bhikkhu, together with their community, had raised funds for renovating a stupa or putting up a Buddha statue or something like that. And then their contribution is carved in the statue, and then we can read that. And in reading those, what we found is that bhikkhus and bhikkhunis are mentioned in roughly the same numbers and also in roughly the same roles. So that the bhikkhunis are leaders of communities, that they are teachers, and that they are frequently mentioned as being Itivuttaka dharini, that memorizers of the Tripitaka, or memorizers of the suttas, or people who are skilled in the scriptures and the texts. And so this is an important record because this is not a somebody's account of what happened, but it's a concrete example from on the ground over a long period of time and a large amount of area in ancient India to show that the bhikkhunis were taking a prominent role in leading communities, raising large amounts of funds, and in education of the scriptures for the communities. So this, together with the evidence from the suttas and so on, then does show that it certainly was not the case that, generally speaking, within Buddhism, that women were not educated or not expected to be educated. Of course, it doesn't mean that things were equal and that access to the Dhamma was going to be equal for everyone. In the Vinaya, there's a special provision for the monks to educate the nuns. And I believe that this is because it was often forgotten about, that the women who came into the Sangha quite possibly had a lower background level of education. And so there had to be an extra special effort to make sure that they were taught and that they had a good grounding and good understanding in the Dhamma. So all of that is to say that the story of Kujudra and the women in the court of Kosambi is not something which is intrinsically unlikely. On the contrary, I think it's actually quite likely that that kind of thing would happen. Kosambi was a powerful and influential city in the time of the Buddha. It was an ancient city, one of the old Vedic capitals, and one of the earliest places in that whole region where we find the use of bricks, fired bricks, and monumental archaeology. So it clearly was like a prestigious place. So this we could kind of count as, if you like, a con in the list of pros and cons as to whether this was spoken by, whether the story is correct. And on the con side, you could say that, well, you want to associate this text with the authority of a great ancient kingdom, right? So then there's a kind of propaganda benefit to making that association. And I think that there's probably, that's certainly a consideration. On the whole, though, I personally find it, quite a plausible scenario. And I think that most likely the general outlines of that story are likely to be true. The final, the most decisive consideration is probably a consideration which Thomas Rhys-Davids put forward over 100 years ago. And as Thomas Rhys-Davids was a lawyer, and he said that in the law, it's regarded as being evidence is regarded as being specially weighty if it counts against the person who's saying the evidence. So if I go up into a court and someone says, were you there at the scene of the crime? And I say, no, I wasn't at the scene of the crime, then, well, that's what you expect, right? But if you say, well, I was at the scene of the crime, then that's regarded as being more likely to be true because it counts against your own interest. So in this particular case, the story of Kujuttara was passed down by the bhikkhus community, but it tends to count against the bhikkhus, right? Because it's like we forgot our lessons and we had to learn it from a bunch of laywomen, which, you know, we would like to everybody to think that we had it all sorted out, but it seems that we didn't. So from that perspective, it seems again somewhat likely to me that that story, or the general outlines of that story, probably have some basis in the truth. Okay, so that's a discussion of the background of the story. Let's just go on and read another couple of suttas. We have another few suttas which follow the same template, completely understanding and giving up greed, completely understanding and giving up hate, and then delusion, and then anger, and then disdain, and okay, so basically following the same pattern, the template that we followed in the first 6 suttas, but with the introduction of the one, the all, which was not there. All right, so then we come up to another sutta template in Itivuttaka number 14. This was said by the Buddha, the perfected one, that is what I heard. Mendicants, I do not see a single hindrance, hindered by which people wander and transmigrate for a long time, like the hindrance of ignorance. Hindered by ignorance, people wander and transmigrate for a long time. That is what the Buddha said. On this it is said, there is no other thing that hinders people like ignorance. Shrouded by delusion, they transmigrate day and night. Those who have given up delusion, shattering the mass of darkness, wander no more. The root is not found in them. So here we're introducing the idea of samsara and the idea of that constant flow of wandering on. And we know from the similes that the Buddha used elsewhere of the length of samsara, that when he said for a long time, he didn't mean for an afternoon or a day or something like that. So a long time means, I mean, I'm sure you know the kind of the similes, but one of the powerful similes was that of a mountain, a mass of rock, 84,000 leagues long, 84,000 leagues high, 84,000 leagues wide, solid rock without any fissures or cracks in it. And if a bird was flying along with a scrap of silk in its mouth and it brushed that scrap of silk against that mass of rock once every 100 years, then the mass of rock would be worn down sooner than samsara would be finished, or sooner, I think, than the eon would be finished. So again, when the Buddha said long time, he really meant it. Okay. Then he introduces the idea of fetters, the next one. I do not see a single fetter, fettered by which people wander and transmigrate for a long time, like the fetter of craving. Fettered by craving, people wander and transmigrate for a long time. On this it is said, craving is a person's partner as they transmigrate on this long journey. They go from this state to another, but don't escape transmigration. Knowing this danger, that craving is the cause of suffering, rid of craving, free of grasping, a mendicant would go forth mindfully. Okay, so this pair of the hindered by ignorance and fettered by craving, this is a sort of a pair of ideas which is introduced in this concept of samsara quite commonly in the suttas, avijja nivarananam tanha sanyojananam, and these kind of reflect two aspects of the defilements and the way that the mind continues to wrap itself up in suffering. Now, my translation says hindered by ignorance, and I have tried to get away from this rendering of hindrance for nivarana, but I have so far failed, as you see. But the real meaning of nivarana has something more to do with like shrouded or closed off or darkened. Like it means hindrance as well. But the basic root of it, the root of it goes back to the Vedas, where the root for Vritra was the primordial dragon who like a python wraps itself around, and like this darkness, it wraps itself around and drags down. So it drags consciousness down, like this primordial darkness that brings you back into the formless ooze of ignorance. You know, this kind of this idea that there's something which is shutting us off, pulling us down from this potential to awaken. And so that imagery of avijja nivaranananga. So this is on the cognitive side, the wisdom side. On the emotional side, tanha sanyojananam, the fetter of craving. Right? So the craving is what attaches us to something, attaches us to sight, sound, smell, taste, and touches, attaches us to experience of pleasure, attaches us to the idea of oneself. So this is like this emotional side. The avijja is the cognitive side. The tanha is the emotional side. And so these two aspects of defilements correspond to the two aspects of meditation that are developed in Buddhism. Vipassana overcomes avidya, and samatha overcomes tanha. And this is taught quite explicitly in the Anguttara Nikaya. So it's through doing vipassana meditation, through seeing clearly, that you can learn to pierce and let go of the ignorance. And it's through doing samatha meditation, that is finding an emotional wholeness and contentment, that you let go of craving. And so this is why the Buddha said that these two things, samatha and vipassana, are always to be developed together, that they are things which are complementary, that they are the two halves of Buddhist meditation. So we shouldn't think of samatha and vipassana as being separate kinds of meditation. They are two aspects of the mind which we develop in meditation to overcome these fundamental defilements of avijja and tanha, of ignorance and craving. Okay. So I'm not going to read all of the suttas here in the first part, but I should just mention that the Itivuttaka is divided is structured in a way that's similar to an Anguttara Nikaya style text. So the Anguttara texts are ordered according to number. So one thing, and then two things, and then three things, and so on. And whereas the Anguttara Nikaya goes up to 11, the Itivuttaka goes up to 4. And so what I'm going to do for this 4-week course is I'll choose some excerpts from each of these 4 chapters to discuss. So this week we're focusing on the 1s, next week will be the 2s. And as we go on, because I haven't finished my translation, so I'll try to translate it as we go. We'll see how that goes, how much time I have time to translate. So what I'm going to do now is just skip up to the end, and as often in Buddhist scriptures, as we find in the Anguttara as well, that when you have a grouping of small suttas, that initially it appears that they don't really have any kind of connection or flow. It seems just like a bunch of different suttas which are put there. But if you look more closely, then you usually find that there is an overarching theme, an overarching structure to what's going on. If you're interested in these questions, I discussed it in the context of the Anguttara Nikaya in my essay on the numbered discourses, which you can find on Sutta Central. And then I analyze a number of cases where there are sort of like spans of structures of themes which then sort of segue into other themes and can repeat and so on. And so it's not the case that each of the suttas are just individual, or the sets of suttas are individual, but there is some kind of loose way, a theme which is being developed over the whole kind of thing. And we saw that the beginning of this is very much about stating what the problem is, right? Because we have this greed, hate, and delusion that we end up in suffering. And so towards the end, it's focusing more on the path, like what is the solution to it. And we find some very lovely suttas at the end of the ones, one talking about generosity. And I'll just briefly read through that sutta on generosity. This is now Itivuttaka number 26. Oh, and another thing I should just notice is that in the text itself is organized according to numbers. So we have the 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s. Then within that numbers you have chapters, and then individual suttas within those chapters. However, in modern editions, we tend to simply number it according to the suttas from the beginning. So with the Anguttara Nikaya, you'll get like 1.1, 1.2, and so on. But in the Itivuttaka, it's just a single number from the beginning to the end. So this is Itivuttaka 26. This was said by the Buddha, the perfected one, that is what I heard. Mendicants, if sentient beings only knew as I do the fruit of giving and sharing, they would not eat without first giving, and the stain of stinginess would not occupy their minds. They would not eat without sharing even their last mouthful, their last morsel, so long as there was someone to receive it. It is because sentient beings do not know, as I do, the fruit of giving and sharing, that they eat without first giving, and the stain of stinginess occupies their minds. That is what the Buddha said. On this it is said, if sentient beings only knew how great is the fruit of giving and sharing, as taught by the great hermit, rid of the stain of stinginess with clear and confident heart, they would duly give to the noble ones, where a gift is very fruitful. Having given food in abundance to those worthy of a religious donation, after passing from the human realm, the givers go to heaven. And when they've arrived there in heaven, they enjoy all the pleasures they desire. The generous enjoy the fruit of giving and sharing. This too was spoken by the Buddha, that is what I heard. So this is a very beautiful kind of summary of the act of giving and the process of giving. And I'd just like to wrap up this first talk by reading from the very last sutta in the ones of the Itivuttaka, and this is number Itivuttaka 27, and this is on loving kindness meditation. This was said by the Buddha, the perfected one, that is what I heard. Mendicants, of all the grounds for making merit with attachment, none are worth a 16th part of the heart's release by love. So just to explain by the phrase, by grounds of making merit with attachment, what it means is it's excluding the experience of enlightenment. So it's just talking about ordinary merit making. It doesn't mean that it's a bad thing, it just means that it's not yet enlightenment. Surpassing them, the heart's released by love shines and glows and radiates. It's like how the radiance of all the stars is not worth a 16th part of the moon's radiance. Surpassing them, the moon's radiance by love shines and glows and radiates. In the same way, of all the grounds for making merit with attachment, none are worth a 16th part of the heart's released by love. Surpassing them, the heart's released by love shines and glows and radiates. It's like the time after the rainy season, when the sky is clear and cloudless, and when the sun rises, it dispels all the darkness from the sky as it shines and glows and radiates. In the same way, of all the grounds for making merit with attachment, none are worth a 16th part of the heart's released by love. Surpassing them, heart's released by love shines and glows and radiates. It's like how after the rainy season, the sky is clear and cloudless. At the crack of dawn, the morning star shines and glows and radiates. In the same way, of all the grounds for making merit with attachment, none are worth a 16th part of the heart's released by love. Surpassing them, the heart's released by love shines and glows and radiates. That is what the Buddha said. On this it is said, a mindful one who develops limitless love weakens the fetters, seeing the ending of attachments. Loving just one creature with a hateless heart makes you a good person. Compassionate For all creatures, a noble one creates abundant merit. The royal potentates conquered this land and travelled around sponsoring sacrifices, horse sacrifice, human sacrifice, the sacrifices of the stick casting, the royal soma drinking, and the unbarred. These are not worth a 16th part of the mind developed with love, as starlight cannot rival the moon. Don't kill or cause others to kill. Don't conquer or encourage others to conquer. With love for all living creatures, you'll have no enmity for anyone. This too was spoken by the Blessed One. That is what I heard. So I'll leave you with that as the last sutta in the ones of the Itivuttaka. And I look forward to joining you for a discussion later on, and hopefully if you can join. And I will also be back with the remaining 3 talks in this course on the